interest trap isn't a conscious manipulation strategy that avoidants deliberately deploy to ensnare unsuspecting partners. It's an unconscious pattern that emerges from their own attachment wounds, their cyclical relationship with intimacy, and their nervous system's responses to closeness and distance. But whether intentional or not, the effect is the same. It creates a psychological dynamic that mirrors addiction, complete with euphoric highs, devastating lows, and a compulsive need for the next hit of connection. The avoidance pattern of approach and withdrawal, warmth and coldness, availability and distance, doesn't just hurt their partners. It fundamentally alters their partner's brain chemistry, creating obsessive thought patterns and addictive attachment that feels impossible to break free from. Understanding how this trap operates reveals why relationships with avoidance feel so consuming, why you can't stop thinking about them even when you know the relationship is dysfunctional, why you keep returning despite repeated pain. The interest trap exploits the brain's reward systems, hijacks your attachment mechanisms, and creates a psychological dependency that has less to do with love and more to do with the neurochemical responses to intermittent reinforcement and uncertain reward. The initial intensity that creates the addiction baseline. The interest trap begins with a period of intense connection that establishes what your brain will spend months or years trying to recreate. In the early stages, the avoidant often shows up with remarkable presence, emotional availability, and focused attention that feels intoxicating. They're curious about every detail of your life. They respond quickly to your messages. They make time for you consistently. They share vulnerable pieces of themselves. They create experiences that feel meaningful and special. This intensity isn't necessarily fake or calculated. For many avoidants, the beginning of a relationship exists in a psychological space where commitment feels distant enough that their defenses haven't fully activated, where closeness feels exciting rather than threatening, where they can be present without the anxiety that will later drive them away. This initial phase creates powerful neurochemical responses in your brain. The combination of novelty, emotional intimacy, physical attraction, and consistent positive reinforcement floods your system with dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. These neurochemicals create feelings of euphoria, bonding, and well-being that your brain encodes as intensely pleasurable. Every interaction with the avoidant during this phase reinforces these neural pathways, teaching your brain that this person equals reward, that their presence produces positive feelings, that connection with them is something to seek and maintain. The intensity of the early phase creates deeper neurochemical grooves than moderate, steady connection would, and these grooves become the channels your brain will travel repeatedly. The initial intensity also establishes an emotional baseline that becomes your reference point for what the relationship can be. Your brain doesn't encode this phase as a temporary honeymoon period that naturally moderates over time. It encodes it as evidence of the avoidant's capacity for intimacy, as proof of what they're capable of providing, as the true version of them beneath whatever distance might emerge later. This baseline becomes crucial to the addiction because it means you'll always be comparing the avoidant's current behavior to their early behavior, always believing that the warmth can return because it existed before, always convinced that if you can just figure out what changed, you can restore what was lost. The avoidance initial intensity often includes elements of idealization that make the connection feel uniquely special and irreplaceable. They might tell you they've never felt this way before, that you're different from anyone they've met, that something about you makes them feel safe enough to open up in ways they typically don't. This messaging creates a sense of being chosen, of having access to part of them that others haven't, of occupying a unique position in their emotional landscape. These statements may be genuine in the moment, reflecting the avoidant's own hope that this relationship will be different. But they serve to deepen your investment, to make you feel that what you're experiencing is rare and valuable, to ensure that when the distance arrives, you'll fight to preserve something you believe is exceptional. The initial intensity creates what psychologists call a dopamine spike, a surge of pleasure-inducing neurochemicals that your brain remembers vividly and seeks to replicate. This spike is more powerful than the steady dopamine release of consistent, reliable connection. It's the difference between the mild pleasure of a predictable reward and the intense high of an unexpected jackpot. Your brain becomes oriented toward recreating that spike, toward recapturing the feeling of those early weeks or months when everything felt easy and intense and perfect. This orientation sets up the addictive cycle because the avoidance later withdrawal will trigger your brain's desperate attempt to get back to that initial high. The addiction baseline established during this phase also includes the encoding of the avoidant as the source of emotional regulation. During the intense early connection, you learn that their presence makes you feel good, that their attention validates you, that their affection creates security and joy. Your brain begins to associate emotional well-being with their availability, unconsciously outsourcing your mood regulation to their behavior. This is a normal part of attachment formation, but with an avoidant, it becomes problematic because their availability will become unpredictable. Your brain has learned to depend on their presence for emotional stability, but their presence will become unreliable, creating a dependence on something inconsistently available. The initial intensity often involves the avoidant mirroring your energy, interests, and values in ways that create a sense of perfect compatibility. They seem to understand you completely, to share your worldview, to want the same things from life and relationship. This mirroring, which may be unconscious on the avoidance part, creates a feeling of having found your person, your perfect match, someone who gets you in ways others haven't. This perceived perfect compatibility deepens your attachment and investment, making the relationship feel too valuable to lose when the avoidance true patterns emerge. You've bonded not just with who they are, but with who they seem to be, and your brain resists accepting that the mirroring might have been temporary rather than indicative of genuine alignment. The addiction baseline also establishes hope as a permanent feature of your experience with the avoidant. Because you've experienced their capacity for intense connection, because you've seen them emotionally available and deeply present, you know it's possible. This knowledge creates persistent hope that the intensity will return, that the avoidant will come back to who they were in the beginning, that patience and understanding will eventually restore the connection you initially experienced. This hope isn't delusional. It's based on real experience, on actual evidence of what the avoidant can provide when their defenses are down. But this evidence-based hope becomes the foundation of addiction because it keeps you engaged through the withdrawal, convinced that what you're chasing isn't fantasy, but a return to something real that you've already experienced. The strategic withdrawal that activates obsessive pursuit. The shift from intense connection to strategic withdrawal doesn't happen abruptly with a clear explanation. It unfolds gradually through incremental changes in the avoidance availability, responsiveness, and emotional presence. Messages that once arrived within minutes now take hours or days. Plans that were once made enthusiastically become vague or subject to last-minute cancellation. Conversations that once explored emotional depth now stay stubbornly surface level. The easy affection and consistent presence that characterized the early phase quietly evaporate, replaced by a subtle but devastating distance that you can feel but struggle to name or address directly. This withdrawal activates obsessive pursuit because it creates a problem your brain becomes desperate to solve. The reward you've been receiving consistently suddenly becomes inconsistent. The connection that felt secure becomes uncertain. The person who is emotionally available becomes distant without clear explanation. Your brain, which has been flooded with dopamine during the intense early phase, suddenly experiences a dopamine deficit. This deficit creates psychological distress, similar to withdrawal from substances. Your brain craves the neurochemical high it's been receiving, and when that high becomes unavailable, it triggers a desperate pursuit response designed to restore access to the reward. The withdrawal is strategic in its psychological effect, not necessarily in conscious intent. The avoidant typically isn't thinking about how to maximize your pursuit. They're responding to their own discomfort with intimacy, their own fear of engulfment, their own need to re-establish autonomy and distance. But the timing and nature of the withdrawal creates maximum impact on your psychology. It arrives just as you've become deeply invested, just as you've adjusted your life to include them, just as you've begun to depend on the connection emotionally. This timing ensures that the withdrawal creates significant disruption, triggering anxiety and pursuit as you attempt to restore what's been lost. The withdrawal activates obsessive thinking because your brain shifts into problem-solving mode, trying to understand what changed and how to fix it. You review recent interactions looking for what you might have done wrong. You analyze their messages for hidden meaning or clues about their emotional state. You monitor their activity for evidence of whether they're actually busy or simply avoiding you. You construct theories about external stresses that might explain their distance. This mental activity becomes compulsive, consuming hours of your day, crowding out other thoughts and concerns. The obsessive thinking serves a function. Your brain believes that if it can just figure out the problem, it can solve it and restore the connection. The strategic withdrawal also creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful conditioning tools for creating persistent behavior. When a reward arrives unpredictably, sometimes yes and sometimes no, it creates much stronger behavioral persistence than when a reward arrives consistently. The avoidance inconsistent availability functions like a slot machine. Sometimes you reach out and get warmth and responsiveness. Sometimes you get coldness or no response at all. You never know which you'll receive, and this unpredictability keeps you trying, keeps you reaching out, keeps you pursuing connection, because the next interaction might be the one that pays off with the warmth and presence you're craving. The withdrawal activates pursuit by creating scarcity where abundance previously existed. The avoidance attention, which was freely given during the early phase, now becomes limited and precious. This scarcity triggers psychological mechanisms that increase perceived value. What's readily available feels less precious than what's difficult to obtain. When the avoidant was consistently present, you might have appreciated their attention, but also taken it somewhat for granted as a normal feature of the relationship. When that attention becomes scarce, it transforms into something rare and valuable, something worth working for, something to be earned rather than expected. The withdrawal doesn't make you want them less, it makes you want them more. The strategic withdrawal also exploits your attachment system's response to perceived abandonment. If you have anxious attachment patterns, the avoidance distance triggers core fears about being unlovable, unworthy, too much. These fears drive frantic efforts to reconnect, to prove your worth, to do whatever it takes to restore the bond. If you have more secure attachment patterns, the withdrawal still triggers confusion and concern because it contradicts the intimacy you've experienced. You pursue not from panic, but from genuine care and desire to understand what's happening and address whatever problem has created the distance. Either way, the withdrawal activates pursuit as you attempt to restore connection and alleviate the anxiety their distance creates. The obsessive pursuit triggered by withdrawal also involves your brain's pattern recognition systems trying to identify what brings the avoidant close and what drives them away. You begin unconsciously conducting experiments. If you give them space, do they come back? If you reach out warmly, do they respond? If you express hurt about their distance, do they offer reassurance or withdraw further? If you mirror their distance, does it activate their own pursuit? This experimental process keeps your attention focused intensely on the avoidant and the relationship, trying to crack the code of what makes them available. The obsessive quality comes from the fact that the code keeps changing, that what worked last time doesn't work this time, that no consistent pattern emerges that would allow you to predict or control their availability. The withdrawal creates obsession specifically because it's unexplained. The avoidant typically doesn't communicate clearly about why they're pulling away, what they need, how long the distance might last. This lack of communication forces you into a position of guessing, interpreting, trying to read their mind and emotions through limited data. Your brain hates uncertainty and will work overtime trying to resolve it, creating elaborate theories and explanations to fill the gap left by the avoidant's silence. The obsessive thinking is your brain's attempt to create certainty in a situation where the avoidant's poor communication has created profound ambiguity. The unpredictable returns that hook your brain chemistry. The avoidant doesn't maintain distance indefinitely. Just as you begin to adjust to their absence, just as you start to create emotional space and consider whether the relationship is worth the pain, they return. Not fully, not with the consistency of the early phase, but with enough warmth and presence to reignite hope and reset the cycle. A thoughtful message arrives after days of silence. A vulnerable conversation happens after weeks of surface-level exchanges. Affection resurfaces after a long period of emotional coldness. Plans are made with genuine enthusiasm after countless vague deflections. These returns feel like relief, like coming up for air after being held underwater, like proof that your patience and understanding are finally paying off. These unpredictable returns create the most powerful aspect of the addiction because they provide intermittent rewards at irregular intervals, which neuroscience has proven creates stronger behavioral persistence than any other reinforcement schedule. Your brain releases a flood of dopamine when the avoidant returns with warmth, creating a pleasure response that's intensified by the preceding period of deprivation. This dopamine spike is more powerful than it would be if the avoidance presence were consistent, because your brain has been craving this reward, has been in a state of deficit, has been desperately seeking the neurochemical high that their availability provides. The contrast between the withdrawal and the return makes the return feel more significant, more rewarding, more valuable than steady presence ever could. The unpredictability of when these returns will happen keeps your brain in a state of hopeful anticipation that mirrors the psychology of gambling. You never know when the next warm moment will arrive, which means you're always monitoring for signs of it, always ready to respond when it does, always maintaining vigilance because the reward could come at any moment. This constant state of anticipation keeps the avoidant at the center of your attention. You're checking your phone for messages, reviewing interactions for hints of warming, staying emotionally available because you don't want to miss the window when they're present. The unpredictability doesn't make you disengage, it makes you hypervigilant. The returns also function to erase memory of the withdrawal's pain in a process psychologists call recency bias. When the avoidant is warm and present, your brain focuses on the current positive experience rather than the accumulated negative ones. The pain of the previous withdrawal fades in significance. The doubts you had about the relationship seem overblown. the decision you might have been moving toward, about ending things, feels premature. The warm moment becomes the entire reality, eclipsing the broader pattern of inconsistency and unavailability. This memory erasure is part of what keeps you trapped, because you never maintain clear awareness of the relationship's overall dysfunction. Each return resets your perception, making you believe things are better than they actually are. The unpredictable returns create what addiction specialists call chasing the high, the desperate pursuit of recreating an initial euphoric experience. You remember how good the relationship felt during the early intense phase. You remember how good it feels during the avoidance returns to warmth and presence. You're constantly trying to get back to those feelings, to make those moments the consistent reality rather than occasional exceptions. This chasing keeps you invested in the relationship far beyond what rational assessment would support, because you're not relating to the relationship as it actually is. You're relating to what it could be, what it sometimes is, what you've experienced during the peaks that make the valleys feel worth enduring. The returns hook your brain chemistry, specifically because they are unpredictable in both timing and duration. Sometimes the avoidant is warm for an evening, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for weeks. Sometimes their warmth is emotional, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's both. Sometimes it includes future talk and relationship progress. Sometimes it's just present moment connection without any indication of where things are heading. This variability in the nature and duration of the returns keeps you constantly trying to figure out the pattern, constantly analyzing what's happening, constantly unable to predict when the warmth will arrive or how long it will last. The unpredictability creates a puzzle your brain becomes obsessed with solving. The neurochemical impact of these returns is profound. When the avoidant reconnects after withdrawal, your brain doesn't just experience relief. It experiences a surge of bonding hormones, oxytocin from physical and emotional intimacy, dopamine from the reward of their presence, serotonin from the reduction in anxiety their availability creates. These neurochemical responses physically reinforce your attachment to the avoidant, creating biological bonds that make separation feel painful at a physiological level. You're not just emotionally attached. Your body chemistry has adapted to their presence and experiences their absence as a form of withdrawal that triggers genuine physical distress. The returns also exploit what psychologists call the peak end rule, where your overall assessment of an experience is disproportionately influenced by its most intense moments and how it ends. The avoidance returns provide the peaks, moments of intense connection, warmth, and presence that your brain encodes as highly significant. These peaks dominate your memory and assessment of the relationship more than the longer periods of withdrawal and distance. When someone asks if the relationship is good, your brain pulls up the peak moments rather than calculating the average experience. This cognitive bias keeps you perceiving the relationship as better than its overall reality, because the returns create peaks that outweigh the valleys in your memory and assessment. The unpredictable returns create a specific form of hope that becomes central to the addiction. It's not hope that things will be consistently good. It's hope that the next return is coming soon, that the current distance is temporary, that patience will be rewarded with another period of warmth. This hope doesn't require the relationship to fundamentally change. It just requires the pattern to continue. Withdrawal, followed by return, distance, followed by reconnection. Your brain becomes oriented around waiting for the return rather than demanding consistent presence. And this orientation keeps you trapped in a cycle that will repeat indefinitely because the returns reinforce your willingness to endure the withdrawals. The returns hook your brain chemistry most powerfully when they include exactly what you've been craving during the withdrawal. If you've been wanting emotional vulnerability, the return includes the avoidant sharing their feelings. If you've been wanting quality time, the return includes them making plans and showing up consistently for a period. If you've been wanting reassurance about the relationship, the return includes them expressing their feelings for you. The avoidant may not consciously know what you need most, but their returns often provide it because your previous communications during the withdrawal phase have indicated what you're missing. Getting exactly what you've been craving creates a powerful reinforcement that makes the waiting feel worth it, that validates your patience, that convinces you to continue enduring the cycle, because the returns eventually provide what you need, even if only temporarily. The emotional roller coaster that keeps you trapped in the cycle. The combination of intense early connection, strategic withdrawal, and unpredictable returns creates an emotional roller coaster that fundamentally alters your psychological state and keeps you trapped in an addictive cycle. The constant oscillation between the high of connection and the low of distance, between hope and despair, between security and anxiety, doesn't just feel bad. It restructures your emotional life, narrows your focus, and creates a dependency on the relationship's drama that becomes difficult to distinguish from love itself. The roller coaster is the mechanism through which the interest trap achieves its full power, transforming a dysfunctional relationship pattern into a consuming obsession. The emotional highs during the avoidance warm phases are intensified by the preceding lows, creating peaks of joy and relief that feel more powerful than they would in a stable relationship. When the avoidant is finally present after a period of distance, when they finally open up after weeks of emotional unavailability, when they finally show affection after extended coldness, it feels euphoric. Your nervous system floods with relief that the pain is over, that the connection is restored, that the relationship is working again. These highs become addictive in themselves because they're so intense, so desperately needed after the deprivation, so validating after the period of questioning your worth and the relationship's viability. The emotional lows during the avoidance withdrawal are correspondingly devastating, characterized by anxiety, confusion, self-doubt, and despair. You experience the withdrawal not just as absence, but as rejection, as evidence that you're not enough, as fear that the relationship is ending. Your nervous system enters a state of hyperarousal, constantly monitoring for threats, unable to relax because the foundation of the relationship feels unstable. You can't focus on other aspects of your life because your brain is consumed with trying to understand what went wrong and how to fix it. These lows are painful enough that the highs feel even more relieving by contrast, creating a cycle where the pain makes the relief more powerful, which makes you more willing to endure the pain. The emotional roller coaster creates what trauma therapists call trauma bonding, where the intense oscillation between negative and positive experiences creates powerful attachment that's difficult to break. The alternation between pain and relief, between fear and security, between abandonment and connection, activates primitive bonding mechanisms that override rational assessment. Your nervous system becomes wired to the avoidant in ways that have less to do with love and more to do with survival responses to threat and relief from threat. This bonding is why you can know intellectually that the relationship is unhealthy while feeling unable to leave emotionally. The bond operates at a level beneath conscious thought and rational decision-making. The roller coaster also keeps you trapped by preventing emotional equilibrium. In a stable relationship, you develop a baseline emotional state that's generally positive with normal fluctuations. With an avoidant, you never achieve baseline. You're always either climbing toward a high or plummeting toward a low, either relieved they're present or anxious they're distant, either hopeful about the relationship's future or despairing about its viability. This constant state of emotional activation becomes normalized. You forget what emotional stability feels like. The intensity of the roller coaster becomes your new normal, and the thought of a stable, consistent relationship can even feel boring by comparison, because your nervous system has adapted to the drama. The emotional highs and lows create a narrow focus where the relationship dominates your emotional landscape to the exclusion of everything else. When you're in a high, the relief and joy feel all-consuming. When you're in a low, the pain and anxiety crowd out other concerns. Either way, the avoidant and the relationship occupy the center of your emotional experience. Work feels less important. Friendships feel less engaging. Hobbies and interests lose their appeal. Your own goals and aspirations fade into the background. The roller coaster demands so much emotional energy that you have little left for other aspects of life, and this narrowing of focus intensifies the addiction because the relationship becomes the primary source of both your pain and your pleasure. The roller coaster also creates a form of emotional dependency where you lose touch with your own capacity to regulate your feelings. During the early intense phase and during the avoidance returns, you feel good and you attribute that good feeling to their presence. During withdrawals, you feel terrible and you attribute that terrible feeling to their absence. Over time, you lose awareness that you have agency over your emotional state independent of their behavior. You forget that you can create joy, security, and peace for yourself. Your emotional well-being becomes entirely contingent on their availability, which means you need them to feel okay. This dependency is the essence of addiction, needing something external to regulate your internal state. The unpredictability of the roller coaster is what makes it so addictive. If the pattern were completely predictable, if you knew that every 2 weeks the avoidant would withdraw for exactly 5 days, you could prepare for it, protect yourself from it, potentially even end the relationship because the pattern would be clear. But the unpredictability keeps you constantly off balance. Sometimes the warm phase lasts a day, sometimes a month. Sometimes the withdrawal is a few hours, sometimes weeks. You never know when you're at the peak before a plunge or in the valley before a climb. This uncertainty keeps you hypervigilant, always monitoring, always trying to read the signs, always unable to relax into the relationship or decisively leave it. The emotional roller coaster also exploits the psychological principle that people are more motivated to avoid loss than to pursue gain. The highs are wonderful, but the lows are terrible, and your brain becomes oriented around avoiding the lows rather than simply enjoying the highs. This means you're constantly trying to behave in ways that will keep the avoidant close, that will prevent the next withdrawal, that will maintain the warm phase as long as possible. This loss avoidance orientation makes you willing to sacrifice your own needs, suppress your own feelings, accommodate the avoidance limitations, anything to prevent the terrible feeling of the low that comes when they withdraw. The cycle of highs and lows creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, where repeated exposure to an uncontrollable negative situation makes you stop trying to escape it. You've tried everything to make the relationship stable. You've given space, you've pursued, you've been patient, you've expressed your needs, you've accommodated their boundaries, you've worked on yourself. Nothing has created lasting change. The roller coaster continues regardless of what you do. This experience of inability to control the outcome can make you passive, accepting the cycle as inevitable rather than choosing to leave. The helplessness keeps you trapped because you've stopped believing that anything you do will make a difference, including the choice to end the relationship. The emotional roller coaster that keeps you trapped in the cycle is ultimately what transforms a dysfunctional relationship into a full addiction. The intense highs create powerful rewards that your brain craves. The devastating lows create deprivation that makes the highs more intense. The unpredictability creates persistent hope and constant vigilance. The trauma bonding creates attachment that overrides reason. The emotional dependency makes the avoidant feel necessary for your well-being. The loss avoidance orientation makes you willing to sacrifice anything to prevent the pain of their withdrawal. And the learned helplessness makes leaving feel impossible, even when you recognize the cycle's destructive nature. The interest trap achieves its full power through this roller coaster, transforming you from an autonomous person with your own emotional center into someone whose entire emotional life revolves around the avoidant's unpredictable availability. Someone who's lost the ability to distinguish between love and addiction. Someone who's trapped not by external force, but by the neurochemical and psychological bonds that the avoidance pattern has created in your brain and nervous system. Breaking free requires not just recognizing the pattern, but actively withdrawing from the emotional roller coaster, allowing your nervous system to recalibrate to stability, rediscovering your capacity for self-regulation, and accepting that the intensity you've been addicted to was never love at all, but rather the dramatic oscillation between pain and relief that the avoidance unconscious patterns created, and that your own attachment wounds made you vulnerable to accepting as normal.